Have you ever asked yourself, why do I do the things I know I shouldn't, and I don't do the things I know I should? Or, if I'm really doing these things, why isn't my life showing the result? If I really believe these things, why don't I see it in my life? These are big questions that come up a lot in my coaching practice when people are confused about the result of their life versus what they think about themselves, the world, and others. More often than not, what it comes down to is a lack of self-awareness, a lack of understanding about how we actually show up in the world and what we actually believe. Early life, this is pretty easy to happen because a lot of our values, belief systems, and stories about ourselves, including our own internal standards, are set by others. Our culture, our society, our family, our friends all had a part in telling us how we should show up in the world and what is most important. I call this our ideal self. Ideal self is generally how we operate for a good portion of our younger years. These set of values that we got from our family and friends, we take with us through high school and then very often into college, which is why at some point in this journey, your parents, more often than not, were probably like, this isn't how I raised my son or my daughter, because you start testing those values that you were taught to figure out whether they're real or not. But in the meantime, your programming or how you've been conditioned to show up says, this is what I ideally value, except for you don't recognize their ideal values. You're just saying what you think you should believe or what you think you should value. This can be very confusing for people who don't actually do the work of figuring out, why do I believe this? Why do I show up this way? Do I actually believe these things? And so we get into later life, or we'll say into second half of our 20s, and our life hasn't quite added up yet. We're confused as to why we're not getting the result we think we should, and we have an assessment of ourselves that's very often not accurate. One of the principles I teach is we must be real about who we are while maintaining optimism about who we can be. And this starts with self-awareness. We have to close what I call the identity gap, the difference between who we think we are and who we actually are, or the ideal versus the real. How do we do this? Well, it starts by becoming more self-aware, aware of why you do what you do, or believe what you believe. If you make statements like, well, that's just what I was taught, or that's how my family is, or that's the culture I grew up in, or that's how we do things in my country, or that's what my parents taught me, or that's how I was raised. These are all statements that indicate you inherited a set of values. That doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but if you don't take the time to actually do the work to figure out whether they're your values or what they mean to you, or how they're connected to you in the real world, you may find yourself behaving in ways that are counter to what you think you really want and not understanding it. And if there's zero awareness around this, you won't even take the time to figure out whether or not there are beliefs or values you're holding that are working contrary to things you're trying to get done in the world. It's as if you're working against yourself and you don't even realize it. It's not uncommon to hear people say things like, I feel like I'm at war with myself, or I feel conflicted, or I'm confused. Those are all indication that you have opposing values or opposing belief systems that are in conflict and they need to be resolved. Clarity is power. When we get clear about who we are and we get clear about what we value, there's a lot of power in what we do. Without that, we have a huge identity gap, or there's a big gap between who we think we are and who we actually are. It causes us a lot of pain and we don't have integrity in our action. It creates confusion. This is why a lot of people will talk about their 30s and 40s and they look back at their 20s and ask, would you go back and relive them? They may want the time back, but most people would not go back and relive their 20s if they had to go relive the process they went through to figure out what they do in their 30s and 40s. Many people start to enjoy their 30s and 40s mostly because they'll say things like, well, I know who I am now. I know what I value. I know what value I bring. All of these things are the integration of self. And if we can speed this process up, some which can, some which is you're going to learn through experience, you can accelerate your own learning, thus your own success or your potency in the world for what it is you want. So why is it that we do things that we say we don't want to? Well, I would like to suggest to you, as a challenge of thought, that we always do what we value most. I get often asked in my practice, how do I figure out what I value? What do I figure out what my real values are? Pay attention to what you repeatedly do. not your ideal self. The ideal self will paint a picture of who we think we are, or maybe ideally who we'd like to be. That isn't necessarily who we are. To get to the real you, you need to figure out what it is that you do constantly. What are the daily decisions that you make? What values drive your daily decisions? Now, my goal is never to tell somebody what they should value. That's your work. But if you can get real about what you actually value, you now have at least a fighting chance to acknowledge and decide whether or not you want to hold those things as valuable. There's a lot of things that help people or stop people from becoming successful that they're not even aware of. And when I mean success, and I talk about success a lot just because of my audience, I think there are certain parts of success that everyone would agree on, right? Most people would say they want to be financially free. Most people would say they want to have healthy relationships, and most people would say they want to be physically healthy. But beyond that, success is going to look different to different people. And so my goal is never to define success for the individual. It's simply to frame it as, I would say success is the pursuit of whatever it is you actually value or want, and the achievement of said goals. What that is going to differ from different people, but the characteristics to achieve success are not terribly different. There is a science to achievement. Right? There's a process to achieving anything, and it comes first of all from being aware of who we are. We have to understand how we show up in the world, and if we're really confused about how we show up, and we don't have any awareness around that, we're going to end up spending most of our time blaming our circumstance or the world or the government or the economy or our family or any list of other things instead of taking a really good look at ourselves. One of my favorite questions to ask in that is, how am I complicit in creating the reality I say I don't want? How am I complicit in creating the reality I say I don't want? This is a tough question for a lot of people. We got to begin to understand how we show up, closing the gap between the ideal self and the real self. As an example, how many times we had a friend that talks about how hard of a worker they are, or how loyal they are, or how committed they are? And we know from being their friend for a long period of time that they're not particularly good at any of those things, but they continue to convince themselves that they are, right? Living from their ideal self. And very often they share those things because maybe they aspire to be that, but more often than not, they believe they need to be those things in order to be loved or to be cherished or to be valuable. Instead of acknowledging, I'm not terribly good at being a hard worker or being very committed or loyal, they feign that they are or suggest that they are. Thus, they don't ever take a look at those characteristics to see if that may be the reason why they're struggling in their profession or struggling in their relationships. But if we don't get real about how we're actually showing up, we'll be confused. Without standards, without an understanding of the base structure in which we show up, we will look at the world and blame the world for our lack of result. In relationships, how often do we start dating someone and either us or them, or generally both, puts their best foot forward? I would suggest best foot forward is generally their ideal self. They're selling you an idea of who they'd like to be, right? And so you're getting all the best parts of them. And it's wonderful, and everybody's having a good time, and the relationship is lovely until we get past the honeymoon phase, or they get more familiar with you, or they get more comfortable with you, and you begin to see who they actually are, real self. And the real, if too far different from the ideal, is the reason very often the relationship ends up having tension, has a conflict, and ultimately doesn't work out. Because the gap between who they sold you on and who they actually are is too big. This is the ideal versus the real. When these two are integrated and we're living authentically who we are, we're living from our deepest values, we're living from our deepest truths, there's a different power in how we speak and how we're related to. Now, when you do that, the potential downside to that is you will generally have a either hot or cold response from people. They will either really love and appreciate how you're showing up, or they may not like you at all. But that is, I would suggest, a far better way to live than trying to appease everyone by showing up as this ideal you that is exhausting because it's not really who you are. Maybe you're sharing values or even hobbies or things that you think you're into because what you really want is to be liked or loved. That isn't who you actually are. The lack of integrity is hurting you long term. Versus if you're, and we all know this, for those who've experienced it, when you're in real relationship where you get to show up as your best self and you get to show up who you actually are and know that you are unconditionally loved for that, that's a different experience. Another way to look at this is our ideal self would potentially be our expectations or our beliefs about who we'd like to be. Our real self is our standards. And remember, we do not rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our standards. How we show up in the world is a reflection of our internal standards about ourselves, far more than our expectations. And this can be really hard for a lot of people to understand or want to accept. And when you start looking around, if you want to understand who somebody is, look at their daily decisions, look at their life. Not in a, we all go through hard times, right? We struggle at different times in our life. And I'm not necessarily referring to one bad time. It's more a body of work, how they consistently show up. Right? We may have seasons where we're less healthy than we'd like to be. We have seasons where we're financially stressed more than we normally are. Or we go through seasons where our relationships are strained. That's still a standard, but a slightly different frame than somebody who, over a full body of work, meaning years of time, you begin to realize, no, this is who they are. Right? They show up this way because they are comfortable being this way. This is who they are. Our ability to see ourselves for who we actually are, not who we think we are, is a huge part of becoming more self-aware so that we can bring meaningful, conscious change to our life in the ways that we can move the needle in the directions that we really want to go. Without this, there's a lot of confusion and frustration, and more people than not look outward and blame the world for why they don't have what they have, instead of assessing the real reason is that they have work to do that they have not done yet. You cannot blame the world for how you're showing up. That's your work.